Hi everybody, are you ready to go into part 2 of church history? We're going to be covering the years 500 to roughly 1000 now, and this is often referred to as the Low Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages will continue on, and we'll talk about that later. I really enjoy talking about this time in history because many people have images of it from movies they've seen or Netflix series or things that they've read. And there is so much art depicting this particular period in time. It seems like we're just really fascinated with medieval times. I subtitled this part, One Church, Two Hearts. And don't worry, I will be explaining that, and it'll become perfectly clear to you why as I go through the years. So let's start. And so where I left off before is this event that is often called the fall of the Roman Empire. But I have a question. Is it the fall of the Roman Empire, or is it the transformation of the Roman Empire? I guess it depends on what historian you're looking at and what personality you have too. Is the glass half full or half empty? So once again, Rome is sacked. Italy is overtaken by these barbarian tribes. The church is being threatened by heresies. Beliefs about Jesus that were so strong and unifying before are starting to crumble. The rituals and practices of spirituality in the early church are continuing to evolve and change. And in the secular world, there's just chaos all over Europe because invaders are everywhere, taking off over strongholds in so many countries and cities. But the Western civilization that had been so protected and had grown so beautifully with church and state in Rome was really in danger of collapsing. Western civilization as they had known it is completely different now. Now, I want you to remember too that this is in Rome. Remember, the center of the empire was still in Constantinople. And the Eastern Church in Constantinople was unaffected by all of this. As a result, that church continued to thrive and to spread to other nearby countries. But since the Pope was in Rome, something had to be done. And what was that? Well, Western civilization had to be saved by the church helping the state. Church history shows us that Christian churches stepped up to restore order in the empire. The Christian clergy and many of the believers joined with leaders and citizens of the state to basically just rebuild all of society. And this meant rebuilding the structures, putting politics back together, fixing the places of worship that had been plundered, and so on and so on. And all of this rebuilding, you can imagine, it took a lot of time, finances, and effort. And I might say there was still pushback, of course, by those who didn't want to see it rebuilt. Because of all of this centering on rebuilding, spiritual and pastoral matters in the church basically went into maintenance mode. What I mean by that is simply that it was put on the back burner. The result? Civilization is restored, but matters of the faith are stunted, are stagnating. They're not going anywhere. But on the bright side, Rome was proven to be protected by God's grace. It was built on a strong foundation, and that foundation was about to come back. Many efforts during this time preserved and conserved the faith. Let's talk about it for a few minutes. I mean, what was it like to be a Christian now? I described those house churches in the early church and how personal relationships had really formed the church. Long gone now are the house churches of yesteryear. In its place, we have a hierarchy. We have popes, we have cardinals, we have bishops and priests. Not only that, but the papacy was the preeminent authority over all of the church and over people's lives, I might say, too. Because what popes and clergy said to the people were sacrosanct. People revered them. They looked at them as God's representatives on earth, and so they did what they said. There were church buildings in every village and city. In the cities, there were these huge cathedrals built and basilicas. In the little villages, the churches were the center of people's social, political, and spiritual lives. Everything revolved around what happened in your church. The majority of people were Christian believers. It didn't matter. You might be just a little farmer in a little village, or you might be an important knight in some, king's palace, but whatever, you were still integrally part of the church. The majority of people then were Christian believers, as I mentioned, but most of them were illiterate. And so if you're illiterate about, you can't read or write, you're not educated, especially about the faith, you had to look to the authority of the church to teach you. That's why these people looked up and revered so much the clergy. To keep the church going, people were required to tithe, that is, give money, goods, time, effort, whatever, to the church. And at the same time, they were taxed also by the state. So everything revolved around it. Some people, though, in all of this, thought that the church was too worldly, and it was inching towards corruption, and I have to say that's probably true. As more people put faith and power into the hands of the clergy, you know what they say, power does corrupt. And so, many of the clergy, the priests and bishops, eventually were in it for themselves. And so, yes, corruption was already part of it. Now remember, as we go through church history, that the church is full of the greatest saints and the greatest sinners, because even though we're headed for a spiritual, hopefully, completion and perfection, we're certainly not there yet. At this time, those who thought it was becoming too corrupt decided that they needed something better, a place that was more reflective of what they thought spirituality of the church should be. And so we have the rise in monasticism, or the building of monasteries. Now, I mentioned in my last talk about the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and so this whole idea of withdrawing from society and moving into a more interior space is now reflected in the building of these monasteries. The laity, and that's anyone who is not clergy, not a priest or pope, they'd been stripped of any church governance. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, any decision making. They couldn't voice their opinion or anything. And so, we have what's called the ignorant masses that emerged from that. So some of those people who were interested in pursuing God in a deeper way, they left their villages and cities, and they became monks, nuns, brothers, and sisters in monasteries. So I want you to kind of put aside what you know about monks and nuns and brothers and sisters today and picture what it was like then. Men and women who went to these monasteries were often illiterate. They often had no choices in life. They wanted to get away from the domineering part of the secular culture, especially women, because in those days women were possessions of their fathers and then husbands, and the only choice they had really was to become mothers. And so if they could go into these monasteries, they could not only become educated, but independent. One of the first monasteries was established in Italy in the year 599 by Saint Benedict of Nursia. And this monastery has greatly influenced all of the monasteries that came after them. The rule of Saint Benedict is still one that people follow today. So great devout souls preserved these traditions of prayer and worship in these monasteries. These are the places where they copied the Holy Scriptures. Remember that the printing press hadn't been developed yet, and so everything had to be copied by hand. You often see this in movies where they're copying manuscripts. But more than that, they were there to really form faith, to develop liturgy, and so forth. They made great strides in these monasteries because they were focused on prayer and work. And so they developed architecture, they cultivated animals, they learned all kinds of crafts, and they taught them to other people. Common people flocked there to not only have spiritual direction from people that had left their lives, but also to experience this higher form of Christianity that was now developing after the Dark Ages. So the monasteries were seen as great lights shining in the darkness, even though they looked like fortresses. The architecture was no mistake. It was like they were big walls around them, and they were shutting out the outside world. But once you got inside, it was a whole different ballgame. Christianity was the very, very center of their lives. I'd like to mention Saint Pope Gregory the Great now, because he had a great influence in overcoming the barbarians and spreading Christianity. He was a monastic in his early life. He was drawn to mysticism and asceticism, but eventually he left the monastery and worked very hard and was recognized for his intellectual abilities and personality. He became the Pope in the year 590, and when he did, he set about to address the barbarian challenge. And he sent many missionaries to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Britain and other countries. This was no easy task in those days. I mention him, though, because he's also called the father of Christian worship. And you might know him in his name from the Gregorian chants that we still sing today. Many people find them very inspiring and moving. I'm one of those people, by the way, included. I listen to Gregorian chant a lot. But he was the one who introduced this way of prayer and devotion. He worked tirelessly in his life to keep Christianity pure and focused. He continued to go back to the scriptures and to what Jesus said. And these Gregorian chants are patterned on the Old Testament and New Testament writings. And so once again, he was proclaiming the kerygma in a different way. And after 600 years of Christianity, this was greatly needed. And I might say, needed today. So if you've never heard Gregorian chant, I can't imagine you haven't, but if you haven't, go to YouTube and start listening. You'll find, or go to iTunes and start listening. you'll find it very, very soothing, and I want you to think of Pope Gregory when you do listen. Meanwhile, the tensions between the East and West increased. Now remember, when I say East and West, I mean between the church in Rome in the West and the church in Constantinople in the East. We refer to these as the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. Again, if you look at a map, you're going to see that not only were they separated by great distances, and remember, there's no postal service, there's certainly no internet, there's really no way of communicating except by courier. Can you imagine how long it took to get a message from Rome to get to Constantinople? So they were separated by this great distance, but they were also separated by language and culture. In the West, it was the Latin Rite. Remember that people in Rome spoke Latin. That was the language of the church and of the day, even though now it's a dead language, they say. In the East, they spoke Greek and other Eastern languages. So we're separated now by distance and language, and so we're also separated then by liturgy. It looked different, the way they worshiped in these two different places. Something happened in the 8th century that kind of drove a wedge. Now, in the Eastern Church, they have what's called iconography or iconoclasm. And if you go into an Orthodox church, even today, you'll see on the walls many, many images, icons, they call them, of Christ and the saints. They look very different from other statues. They're flat. They have a lot of gold in them. They don't look realistic at all. Some people think that they're ugly. I personally love them. But I know a lot of history about them as well. Anyway, in the 8th century, this iconoclasm, veneration of the images of Christ and the saints, was very big in the Eastern Church. It was the center of their faith and liturgy. But the Pope in Rome prohibited them from venerating these images. Not only did the Pope drive a wedge doing that, but he increased the taxation of Rome by Constantinople. And so there began this animosity on both sides. So if Constantinople was demanding taxation by Rome, and then the Pope in Rome is telling them, you can't worship the way you want to worship, tensions are rising. There was also a threat to the papacy and the territories around the papacy, and they asked for help from the Byzantine emperor, and he said no, he did not protect them. Okay, so anger increased on both sides, and here we go again. Something had to be done. So during these great tensions between the East and the West, Pope Gregory decided that he needed another solution, one that would make the West much more powerful. And so he sought an alliance with the French. And this set the stage for a revolution in papal diplomacy. It strengthened the church in Rome to become a fully Western entity. And so he severed alliances with the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, and he set up this new alliance with the Carolingian dynasty and the coronation of the first Carolingian king. Now, when you talk about Carolingian, it simply refers to the Franks or the French dynasty. So you can see he's turning more to the West and getting their power and trying to get them into an agreement or a coalition, and then at the same time cutting off ties with the Byzantine emperor. There was a legend at this time. It's called the donation of Constantine. And the Pope used it as a justification for why he could do this, that he had primacy in the West. Now, the donation of Constantine is a legend. I'm not going to go into it, but you can look it up. They pretty much have proved that it did not really happen, and yet the people of the time believed it. I liken it today to the conspiracy theories that are still very popular in the year 2021. It was kind of like that. People were told this legend, they passed it on word of mouth, and pretty soon people believed it, even though it wasn't even true. Anyway, this alliance that the Pope forged with the Carolingian dynasty was kind of the high point in the development of the early medieval church. There were many really great leaders in this Carolingian dynasty, including a man named Pippin, which you might have heard because there was actually a play made about him, a movie, and a movie, I guess, too. Anyway, his son, Charlemagne, whose name was Charles the Great, came along, and Charlemagne was an amazing man who united the Western Empire. Probably the most notable thing that happened was that the Pope actually crowned him emperor in the year 800 AD. Now, I know that the popes were crowning other emperors, but think of the significance of this. Never before had a Frenchman been crowned emperor by a pope. And so he was the first recognized emperor in Western Europe since the fall of Rome, since 451. This is almost 400 years later. And when he was crowned, it united Europe for the first time. Charlemagne went to war and enlisted the Pope to help him build his armies. They formed a partnership, and he, in turn, Charlemagne, established a papal state for the Pope in Italy. Charlemagne did so many things, I'd need a whole PowerPoint just to talk about him. But let me go over some of the highlights. He instituted many church reforms. He rooted out corruption in the clergy. He began a cultural revival, and he mandated that schools be built in monasteries and cathedrals to teach not only the clergy now, but the laity too. Remember, there was illiteracy everywhere. He also presided over church councils. And so he was very concerned with the heresies that were infiltrating the church. And he went back and he was a leader in defining church teachings. One of the most important ones was the belief in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. So Charlemagne is a main character in strengthening the Western Church in Rome. Missionary efforts continued because the Carolingian rulers wanted all of Europe to become Christian, and so they sanctioned an Anglo-Saxon monk, his name was Boniface, to teach to the Saxons in England and to reform the Frankish churches as well. So they sent him there, and when he went there, because he was sent from Rome, he increased interest wherever he went, and he promoted this devotion to St. Peter that now became very important and to the forefront of many Christians. Can you see how this would provide a foundation then for the later building of St. Peter's and the Vatican? So the Carolingian dynasty was very effective in helping the church grow. It eventually died out after Charlemagne's death because his descendants divided the land, and whenever you divide something, it doesn't really return to power like it did before. Some historians say that it did return to power later in France, but it wasn't this whole European movement that it was before. And here's just another event in history that I'm going to introduce to you now because it happened in the first 1,000 years. And I'm going to come back to this when I give the third talk. But it was the rise of Islam in the 7th century. The religion of Islam, remember, was founded by a man named Muhammad, who's considered a prophet in the Middle East. And he was born in the city of Mecca, and he lived in the city of Medina, and those are very sacred cities to Muslims even today. The basic belief of Islam was to surrender your will to God. And you did that by listening to the messenger, Muhammad, who wrote down the revelations that he had from God in a book called the Quran. But, you know, maybe you don't realize it, but Islam regarded this religion as a return to the original faith of the Old Testament prophets and of Jesus. They didn't see Jesus as God, but they regarded him as a very holy and important prophet. All right, so while Muhammad was having these revelations and his thought and this religion started to spread in the Middle East and in Northern Africa, he believed that he was called to unify the Arabian Peninsula. And he wanted to be sort of like Constantine. He wanted to unite the East and the West. And so he amassed a great army of people who believed the way he did and began to take his armies through these areas and conquer them, physically conquer them. And so by 622, he had unified Arabia. And then he pushed further and he conquered Syria and Palestine and Armenia and Egypt and Northern Africa. He spread outward to India and Asia. And because now of this great influence of Muhammad and threat to Christianity, they saw it as a threat, it further weakened East and West Christianity. I'm going to say a lot more about Islam and what happened later because this gave rise to the Crusades, but we're going to leave that now just for a little bit because there are a few other things that we need to discuss. For a few minutes now, let's return to the two empires that were beginning to feel disconnected from one another. There's the Roman Empire, and if you look at this map, it's outlined in red, filled in red. And there's also the Eastern or Byzantine Empire that's in orange. Now, in the Roman Empire and in the Byzantine Empire it is supposed to be one church, and that is the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, only one church. But because of the distance, as I mentioned before, and the language and the culture and everything else, the church in the West, where the Pope resided, became very antagonistic to the Eastern Church. In the Eastern Church, they had in place patriarchs who were overseeing the ongoing teaching and liturgy and so forth. And they were under the Pope in Rome. The Byzantine Empire was stable, it was powerful, it was economically sound, the culture there was highly defined, and I might say their military force was to be reckoned with. As I mentioned before, the Eastern Byzantine Empire was unaffected by the Western problems. While the Western Church was dealing with the sacking of Rome and all of that, and coming out of the Dark Ages, the Eastern Church was flourishing. The Eastern Church had a deep theology. They had an amazing liturgy, a very high liturgy that was very cultural. Their spirituality was evolved to a quite high point. And their liturgies or their masses looked very different from the Western rites. If you've ever been to an Eastern Rite church, to any of their liturgies or services, you can see that right away. They're very long. They are steeped in rituals that don't look familiar to most Catholic churches. And they have, they sing in different languages. They have different music. They have different icons in their churches and so forth. Even their architecture looked different. They had culturally adapted to their surroundings. And they considered themselves to be much more advanced in theological development than the Western Church, and most historians agree that they were. However, there was a very unfortunate result. The development of the Catholic Church or the Christian Church, one church, two hearts. Look at the architecture here. Two distinct communities who didn't recognize each other. And that became very unfortunate for what happened next. Many disputes then arose, not only about theology, but about politics, about culture, and so forth. But the one main question continued to come up over and over again. Who has the authority over the church, the one church? Would it be the Pope in Rome? Or is it the Patriarch in Constantinople? Animosity, that's the word. Animosity grew and grew and grew. The Pope and the Patriarch began to fight with each other, vying for power and influence. The Patriarch wanted nothing to do with the Western Church. He saw what had happened, that the Pope had aligned himself with the Carolingian dynasty and had united Europe. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire, the Patriarch was the one who was more important and tried to bring Rome under him. Well, the two at the time began to fight. The Pope said, if you don't stop this and give your allegiance to the Western Church, I'm going to excommunicate you. And the Patriarch basically retorted the same to the Pope. If you don't succumb to the Eastern Rite, I will excommunicate you. And so in the year 1054, they excommunicated each other. This resulted in what's called the Great Schism of 1054. The Patriarch in the East forbid his Eastern Rite churches to perform the Latin Rite. They never did anyway, but they said, if you remain in allegiance to the Pope, you're out. He renewed the liturgy in Greek, and he declared that the Eastern Church was Orthodox Christianity, not under Roman Rite any longer, not under the Pope any longer. And he inserted the word Orthodox into the titles of the Eastern Rite churches. Some of those still prevail today. Consequently, the Pope severed all the ties with these dissenters. He said they were outside of the church, they were excommunicated. Anyone who followed them was excommunicated. And so you have the Great Divide. And sadly, this Great Divide remains today. Before I talk about that any further, I'm just going to say that some Eastern Rite churches refused to separate and stayed under the Pope. And I gave you a blue handout, and you can see what the names of those churches are. The easiest way to recognize them is using the word Orthodox. If you see the word Orthodox in the title of a church, then you know that it is not under the Pope, like the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox Church. There are other Eastern Rite churches like the Melkite Church and so forth. They don't use the word Orthodox, but they follow the Eastern Rite, but they still have allegiance to the Pope. Okay, so now we have the first great division. For the first 1,000 years, even though the church was threatened with so many heresies and divisions and disagreements and all kinds of things, as you see, it never divided, it never separated. The church always saw itself as a koinonia. That is a Greek word that means a stronghold. You didn't break the koinonia, no matter what. No matter what happened, you stayed together in one church. 1,000 years, and now we have a split, divided for the first time. And it wasn't really about what they believed. It was more a political situation that caused it. There were some disagreements in what they believed, in theological differences, but they were very slight. And if you want, I'll talk about those a little bit later, or we can take that up in class as a question. Time now to take another pause. Is all of this new to you? What impressions do you hold about the ancient church that are either inaccurate or out of date? Take a few moments to write down your questions and your comments so that we can further discuss them. This second 500 years seems like it went faster. It doesn't mean that there wasn't more. It's just I'm trying very hard to just hit the highlights here. But you get the picture here of the low Middle Ages and what that meant for the people. And this sets the stage for the next 500 years, the next 1,000 years, which I will take up next week in our continuation of church history. I look forward to talking to all of you about what I've said in both the last talk and in this one. Thanks for listening.